Hello, this is Nicole from thismomentisgood.com. Today, I'm going to briefly talk about converting needle knitting patterns to the loom. In some ways, this is really easy, and in other ways, it's very complex. As I was going over it, I had a request from someone to make a clear video of how to do this. I feel that it's better in a blog post than it is in a video. It's not something you can really just show someone. Vintage Storehouse and Company has a really good one where they actually go through and they use a graph and they do all that. I don't do that when I convert patterns. I don't make graphs and that kind of thing. But they did, and that's one way to do it. And honestly, visually, if you're a very visual person, I think that's a really great video to watch, so that you can kind of see it in action of what they're doing to convert the patterns. Okay, so why I say it's very simple in some ways. The only difference between needle knitting and loom knitting in its very basics is that we have no wrong side of our knitting. I mean, we don't knit on the wrong side. We only knit on the right side. So as we're going around our loom or back and forth across our loom, if we're knitting flat, we are always on the right side. Whereas a needle knitter, when they're knitting, would have their knitting on the needles, and at the end of every row, they would flip it and go back the other direction, but they're working on the opposite side. We never work on the wrong side. We only work on the right side. So what does that mean? Now, if they're knitting in the round, they never are on the wrong side. They are also stay on the right side of the knitting. So there's where it's easy. If you have a pattern that knits in the round, you don't have to convert the stitches. The stitches are all the same. Now, where it gets complex is if it's lace, you can't just convert the stitches. In some of these videos, I see that it's been made quite simple, and it looks simple. It really isn't. Unless you really know how you would convert those stitches, I think lace knitting is an exception to this rule. If you're just starting out converting patterns, start with knit, purl, Gansey patterns, Fair Isle, color work. Most color work is pretty easy but once you start getting into less basic increasing and decreasing. Now, I'm not talking about knit two together where you're making eyelets. Eyelet patterns, they should be fairly easy to convert. And Vintage Storehouse has the opposites. They have a chart that you can download. It's really not that hard. If it's a knit, you change it to a purl. Okay, now when do you change it? All right, I just told you when you're knitting in the round, you convert none of the stitches. They are also always on the right side of the stitches. You can just do the pattern with one covet. You must figure out what their gauge is. Okay, we'll get to that later. Okay, we're going to stick with what happens when the pattern is knit flat and you want to do a scarf or something like that that's knit back and forth, not in the round. Then you have to convert all of your wrong side rows to the opposite stitch. It's that easy. If it's a knit, you change it to a purl. If it's a right twist, you change it to a left twist. There's really not much more to it. If it's a K2 tog, knit two together, you change it to a purl two tog. So that's basically all you have to do. Sorry, I have to every once in a while take a sip of coffee. It's storming out today and my allergies are going crazy. So to keep myself from coughing, I have to take breaks here and there so I don't choke through the whole video. Okay, so when you are flat panel knitting, now all of this is going to be on the blog site. We already have it up. I'm going to add a few things to it about gauge because that's something I left out. Gauge is so important. Okay, so basically that's all there is to it. If you are doing flat panel knitting, on the wrong side rows, you change it to the opposite stitch. Simple as that. Okay, so here's where it starts to get complex. I'm going to show you, I'm marking this page because I'm going to show you something in the book a little bit. Wow. Here's where it starts to get complex. When you have a chart like this, when you start seeing yarn overs away from any kind of movement of the stitches, which this is the only movement of your stitch, that's a past the slip stitch over. Somehow you have to move all these stitches inward to get to that PSO before you can put a yarn over in. I have another video explaining this much more in detail, but here you can see this is what a needle knitting pattern might look like. Very short, concise. This is what mine looks like. It gets much more complex because to do this yarn over, you have to move all these stitches to do these 2 yarn overs. Like I said, I get into it in more detail in another video, which is already out, on lace knitting. This way of doing things only applies to my patterns. I don't think anybody else does it this way. The reason I do it this way, it makes it short and concise. Then move peg 1 to peg 2 to peg 3 to peg 4. Well, I want you to really know what you're doing, what you're trying to achieve. And what you're trying to achieve is do this PSO before you can do your yarn overs. So you can refer to that video. It's under the playlist Increasing and Decreasing, and it says it's something titled Lace Stitches, I believe. I'm reading the charts or something like that. So in this, it's not as simple as just, oh gee, convert, do a knit 1, a yarn over, knit 3, do a PSSO, knit 3, and do a yarn over. It's not that simple because you can't do this yarn over because you have a stitch on your loom. So you have to move that stitch out of the way so you can put a yarn over there and create your hole for the lace. So it's not as simple as just putting this in a video. It gets much more complex once you do lace, and that's why I'm saying this is a beginner's discussion about how you convert the needle knitting patterns over. Okay, oh, look at that. I don't think I have this. Oh, yeah, here's the second sheet. I'm sorry. Okay, let's talk a little bit about gauge. Your pattern's going to have a gauge. Gauge is important when converting patterns. You can't convert a pattern unless you meet the gauge of the pattern. I get endless requests, sometimes 10 a day, asking me, can they change the loom? Can they do this pattern on the loom? Yes, if you figure out the gauge. Now, something like my Ugg boots, you can't convert to just any loom. It's not going to be that easy. If you convert to, I had someone who did them a little toddler boot on a loom larger than this and was wondering why her boot wouldn't stand up. It was two looms up. I think the red loom, maybe it's 1 loom up. It's 31 pegs wide for a toddler boot. So you can't just go to any loom. It has to be something that's going to be of similar size. But the circumference, you can't just line a smaller gauge loom up with this and say, oh, she's using that same circumference. No, because you're going to get less shrinkage both ways. I'm kind of getting off track here, but gauge matters. So it's important when you're converting a pattern. This is something that's left out in almost every time, including my blog post. I left it out also, of why is gauge so important? And what is gauge? Okay, gauge is the math. And when people tell me that their pattern is not coming out, it doesn't happen very often, but every once in a while I have someone who's arguing. I'll ask them, did you do a gauge swatch? Are you meeting gauge? Because on things like the topper pattern, tunics, sweaters, clothing, things that gauge matters. Hats even. Sometimes people say the hat doesn't fit, the hat doesn't fit. Well, are you meeting gauge? Now, some of my earlier patterns, they weren't gauged. I just literally did them for the loom. Now all my patterns are gauged. That was when I was first beginning, and I was so loom specific at that point that I really just didn't, and for most of those things, it really just didn't matter. Okay, so back to what is gauge. All right, so what you want to do is if you're looking at a regular needle knitting pattern, you want to knit a gauge. Some of my swatches look like this. They're the complete in the round because I want to see what it's going to do. Now, of course, I'm designing, so mine would be bigger. I recommend doing a 5x5 swatch and maybe even measuring in different areas. So how do you do that? Okay, so you knit 5 inches by 5 inches, just guess. Try to make it a little bigger instead of smaller. Gives you more surface. And then what you do is you count how many stitches you have. Write it down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so that would turn into 18 stitches, because I'm going to double it, equals 4 inches in stockinette. Then I'm going to find out what my rows are. 1, 2, and I'm just going to count all the way up the line. I think it's about 22. Not 22. 12, and then it'll be 22 when I double it to 4 inches. Okay, this is only a 2-inch measurement. And that just makes it easier when you're working with larger to work in 4 inches as opposed to 2 inches. But you can work in the 2 inches. The math will be the same. Doesn't matter, but all the books are printed that way, so I always work in 4 inches. Okay, so you have to meet the gauge of their pattern. Now, if your gauge is coming out larger, you have to use a smaller gauge loom. If your gauge is coming out, what did I say? Did I just say, I'm sorry. I'm going to start again because I'm not exactly sure what I even just said. If your gauge is smaller than intended, you're going to have to use a larger gauge loom. If your gauge is larger than intended, then you have to use a smaller gauge loom, meaning you have more rows or less rows and more stitches or less stitches. Then you have to figure it out until you... A good way to start is finding a chart like this that's in my book. This can start. A lot of times what you're going to see, this is in Round Loom Knitting and 10 Easy Lessons, this chart. Okay, and I'll try to show it to you here. All right, so this will give the knitting needle comparison, 9mm, 6mm, etc. And it's going to give the gauge, meaning how many stitches you should be getting per inch, yarn weights. Something like this can be really useful in where do I start? What are they using? But let me just be really frank here. I am with a knitting group every week, and they're constantly changing their needles to meet gauge. So this is just the starting point for where to start, what loom would be comparable to those needles. But it can be very helpful. So it's good to learn about gauge, learn about swatching. That's all explained in the book here. Converting patterns is not, but like I said, this is on my blog post. I'm just going to add a little bit more. Okay, so let's give you some examples. Now that we've done our gauge swatch, we're meeting gauge, what would we do? If you're flat panel knitting and you are on the right side, knit 5, purl 5, repeat from start. That's what the needle knitting pattern looks like. In loom knitting, it's going to be exactly the same because you're only knitting on the right side. That's the right side rows. They are on the same side as loom knitters, so we don't need to convert those rows. Okay, now their needle knitting row in the same pattern, and all wrong side rows, it says, are saying knit 4, purl 1, knit 1, purl 4. The loom knitting would look the exact opposite. You would change all of these stitches to the opposite. That knit 4 turns to a purl 4. That purl 1 turns to a knit 1. Purl 1, knit 4. And that's it. You just change them. And that's when flat panel knitting. When you're knitting in the round, no conversion is needed. Because needle knitters are also working on the right side throughout the pattern. And again, converting becomes much more complex when you're working with lace. I'm going to have this, I'll have a link to this blog post. It's easier to read it than it is to talk about it. And you can watch my lace video, so you kind of start to see where we divert, why it's not so easy to just convert a lace pattern. Eyelets, they're really easy. They'll have yarn over K2 tog. You would do a yarn over purl 2 tog on what they say is the wrong side rows. It's not that hard. But lace, when you start getting into just plain yarn overs, PSSOs, things like that, you start to get a little bit more complex. It's not quite as easy. Okay, I hope this helps you out and maybe kind of explains why the videos are kind of confusing and not giving you all the information you need, because it's easy in some respects and it's complex in other respects. So I hope you have a great day, and thank you for listening.